Hello everyone, my name is Nefi Dorantes and the name of my presentation is called Sharia Enforcing Islamic Laws, and I hope that you're able to learn something from my presentation today. So let's begin. These are some of the main ideas that I want to talk about in my presentation. Number one is, what is Sharia law and where does it come from? Number two, what makes Sharia law? Number three, controversies of Sharia law. 4, benefits of Sharia's law. And number 5, a conclusion. I just want to wrap up with some of my thoughts as I've done some of the research for this presentation. So let's get started. Number 1, what is Sharia law and where does it come from? So let's begin by answering the first question, and I'm gonna focus most of my presentation on this, on the history of Sharia law and where does it come from. So let's begin. Sharia law. So Sharia in Arabic means the way or the path. And in a nutshell, Sharia law are just a set of rules and principles that help individuals deal with many aspects of both public and private life. So it's just a set of rules that people go to for questions on how to deal with them. And let us also remember that at first it was not a legal system. So let's begin. So I'm going to explain a little bit on this little graphic that I made here. So let's begin by understanding the Quran. So for those that don't know, the Quran is just sacred text that was written by a devout man who was seen as a prophet by the name of Muhammad. And he received various revelations from the angel Gabriel, and those revelations are what is known as the Quran. Okay, so let's keep going with this story to introduce the Hadith. So when Muhammad was alive, they would often refer to him for questions or doubts, and when he died, people began to refer to the Quran as well as the Prophet's friends and the family, and they did this because they thought that they had a better idea of what he could have said. In response, the Prophet's family and friends would tell stories about what he said to better explain their answers, and this eventually these were compiled and is known as the Hadith. So the Hadith is just the teachings of the Prophet, stories, and that's how the Hadith came about. And now let's move on into the Sharia part. So eventually, all these stories and teachings, principles, as well as common practices, were put together into a system, and that system was called Sharia, and that's how the Sharia came about. So let us remember that the goal of this was to try to get close as possible to what the Prophet Muhammad would have said if he was still alive. So that was their goal. So as we continue, some Muslim rulers decided to make some of these Sharia principles into laws to show that these laws were Islamic-based laws, and this brought about what is known today as Islamic law. So this little graphic helps us understand better the difference between Sharia and Sharia law and how they were different, and also how Islamic laws were about. Okay, so let's put everything together. Islamic laws are based on interpretation of Sharia, and Sharia is based on interpretation of both the Quran and the Hadith, and Sharia is different from Sharia law. Those are two different principles to remember. So let's go to the second part, which is what makes up Sharia law. And I took this from one of our course videos, and this is just a little snippet of different Sharia laws. And as you can see, this is the harder part of the laws. As you read, their drinkers are whipped, thieves get their hands cuffed, husbands are commanded to hit their wives if they're high-minded. And I just wanted to show this little snippet, not only because you get to see the extreme side of the Sharia law, but also because I didn't want to focus a lot on these laws. I wanted to mostly focus my presentation on how this is brought about and how it affects people today. But just remember, as you see this this is the harsher part of Sharia law. So let's move on into our controversies. And as you saw previously, number one is harsh and excessive. It has harsh and excessive punishments. Number two is very hard to be a woman under Sharia law. And number three, extremist. And what I mean by extremist is that people have used both the Quran and Sharia laws in their own version to justify acts of violence, of war, and of terrorism. And these acts have been justified by calling them sacrifices. And this is because most extremists want to go back to the old basic Islamic religious laws. And that's just something that we need to think about as we think about controversies. Um, Number four, I also want to talk about some of the benefits. Um, as you can see, not everything part of the Sharia law is very extreme. I stumbled across an interview. I stumbled across an interview made by BCC with a British Muslim, and they asked him a very interesting question. The question was, does Sharia make life easier or harder for the ordinary Muslim? And his response is very interesting. He says, much easier for those who strive to live the correct life, pleasing to God and in kindness and peace and with the neighbor, and much harder for those who are selfish, cruel, exploitative, dishonest, etc. And he goes on to say that all those are Sharia law is molded, it is moldable. Let's continue with what he said on his interview, which is the second question. Why has Sharia become a synonym for cruelty and lack of compassion? And one of the things that was interesting is that he said that the ignorance of the reality of Sharia law in much publicized cases, and by he meant with that is that sometimes we don't know what entails Sharia law when it comes to the steps of making these punishments or how moldable this law can be, and also about publicized cases that sometimes the media puts up front, really harsh cases. And yes, he does talk about many cases of cruelty and harsh punishments that we have seen in the news today. But he says that these are made out of hatred by the extremists and what he calls Muslims in disguise, meaning people that are doing this to get a reaction from people, to incite violence, to incite anger and hatred, even amongst different religious sects. And it comes to my conclusion. I just want to clear some points out as and some of the things that I learned during my presentation. Number one is we need to have a complete, full understanding of Sharia law. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of reading to do when it comes to this law and understanding as well that. Which leads me to my second point is that common practices during Prophet Muhammad's they are not common today. Sorry, there was a typo there, but they're not common today. Um, Sharia law is part of that, and we just remember that. Which leads me to my last point. Sharia law is it can be comparable to the law of Moses. We would think of the law of Moses as cruel, and we don't live it today. But we do have the higher gospel, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ, which we believe. And that's how Sharia law can be seen as the law of Moses. It's something that was practiced back in the day, that was common back in the day, but that's something that is not practiced today. And let us remember that some people will go back to the basic principles as taught by the Quran and the Hadith. And that's something that we must remember, that these are just sources that people go to for questions and answers, and Sharia law is something that was common back in the day, and that can be molded even today. And that's something that I found very interesting. That there are some countries that still have, especially in Europe, they have their own versions of Sharia law, and each country has adapted its own version of it, and it's within their laws. That's something very interesting to note and to think about. And I'm hoping that you're able to learn something from my presentation. Thanks again. My name is Nafi Dorantes, and this has been my presentation on Sharia law.